know about the Equal Rights Amendment in any way, shape, or form. This is brand new information. And it's okay, this is not a shaming moment where you're gonna, no? So everyone here was aware of it, had a kind of a basic understanding. So then, film, was there anything shocking that you didn't know? Or that makes you kind of go, oh my God. Anyone? It's full of a lot of numbers, there's a lot of statistics, a lot of facts. Nothing stood out? Yeah?
Well, I forgot how close it was to passing originally.
Yeah.
And that, and some of the states that didn't pass it, like Illinois, was a little surprising.
And I don't know how many of you were aware of Phyllis Schlafly and her movement in Illinois.
Oh, she was in Illinois.
Yes.
For some reason
That's where she was based out of, yeah. Yeah, she... Yeah.
Well, it wasn't that long ago that I really did not know that Alice Paul had written it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a not lifelong, but since I came to college, 35-year member of the League of Women Voters. And when you think about it, it's taking us longer to get this done than it took to get the vote. And that was 72 years.
Right.
And so it just brought it home to me. This was just not a, I think that Phyllis Schlafly and her people made so much fun of the people in the 1970s, like what a weird idea. Mm-hmm. And yet it had been penned in the 1920s.
Correct.
And that's something I only became aware of a couple of years ago. So.
Yeah. And it came right, it was happening concurrently actually with the suffragette movement to get the right to vote. This idea of equality fully under the law was born then. And I feel like there's a lot of ricochet here. Can I feel so far away.
If you're behind the speakers, you're not going to get the echo.
Okay, I'm still getting it. Can people, if I don't use it? That's fine.
If we want the speakers or the audience questions to be
Right.
recorded, we probably should amplify those or at least repeat those.
Sure. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to hang out right here. So I hate being far away. I don't. So yes, that, and for me too, so I come from Montana originally, that's where I hail from. Montana has an ERA in its state constitution, people. So does Texas. So Minnesota does not. I didn't know about really any of this until I moved to Minnesota in 2013 and learned about what was happening here and the fact that there wasn't an Equal Rights Amendment in the state constitution and the fact that we didn't have one nationally. This was all brand new news to me. I was one of these people who thought, we're good, we're not good, we're not okay. So yes, so Alice Paul was a name I had never heard of as I grew up in history classes, and I think that's where a big piece of this comes from, is education and the lack of it. There has not been an education piece around the Equal Rights Amendment, around this part of the amendment process, of how it works to amend the Constitution, of that level of civic engagement. So here we are coming up on the 200th anniversary of women's right to vote. For most women, of course, not all women, some that came later. So this fits, right, to finally put these two pieces together and have this happen. Virginia became the 38th state for the federal ERA. So that has just happened. So that is super exciting. I know a lot of people are like, oh, but it didn't really happen because there's this and there's this and there's this and there's this. No, there's always this and this and this. In the amendment, there's 2 years allotted for lawsuits to come up because that's what happens every time there's a slightly, iffy amendment that people are very reactionary against. There's lawsuits. So right now there are attorney generals in 3 states who are fighting to say, yes, this should still go forward. The artificial deadline is in fact an artificial deadline. The sun did not set for many various reasons. The deadline does not hold up. And there are 3 states attorneys generals who are fighting to say, yes, the deadline did happen. This is a dead issue. So we're leaving it up to the attorney generals to do their job. So the 3 attorney generals fighting for are the 3 states that most recently ratified. So Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia. And the states who are fighting against are Alabama, I believe Georgia, and South Dakota. We'll let them do their job. It will be fine. So again, at the national level, everything is moving forward full steam. Here in Minnesota, though, we are still hitting a major wall of getting this moved to get into our state constitution. There has been legislation introduced every session since 1983 to get this into our state constitution. Sometimes we get hearings out of one body. Sometimes we get hearings out of the other body. Last session, we actually got it voted and approved off the Minnesota House floor. So that is fantastic. Huge step there. That was historic to get it out of the House. Senate, different, whole different climate over in the Senate. So our big push now is to really focus on the Senate this session, to get hearings, to get it out to the Minnesota public to vote on this fall in the elections. Because that's what it's really about. And as I'm driving here, I'm thinking, well, such a big piece of American history and values, and if that's what everyone fights against with the ERA is the values, that it's going to attack American values, one of the biggest American values is the ability to stand up for what we believe in and to be able to talk about it and then to take it to a vote. This is what we stand on. So if we truly, truly want to say that more than half of our people don't get to have that level of protection in the Constitution, they don't get that coverage, they don't get to be given a fair trial under the correct case law, because right now as it is with that indiscriminate scrutiny, cases that come up against discrimination on gender and sex just are kind of thrown out wherever. So to give it that proper status, that constitutional foothold, that proper respect, so that those people can feel that they're getting their fair due in court. As we're coming up on the anniversary of women's right to vote, as we're coming up on all this historic stuff happening nationally, this is really when we want to push hard on the Senate to say, give Minnesotans the chance to vote on this. Give them the chance to say whether or not they want an ERA in their state constitution. So that is what's happening, and now I really like to turn it to questions if anyone has any questions. Yeah, we'll go in a row, 1, 2, 3.
Last week, after the U.S. House passed the ERA amendment, there was an article in the New York Times that basically was very depressing in my mind, that said that there was really very little chance that it would ever get a hearing in the Senate because of their stance on not hearing it. And also, they made a comment that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had made a statement that we should start over. And my question is, do you know what was behind her statement or the context of where she made that statement?
Right. So what you're referring to with the passing of the U.S. House is the delete the deadline bill. And so that was a bill that Minnesota had a version of, and a lot of states had a version of, and then nationally, the U.S. Congress had over 230 co-sponsors on this bill to remove the deadline, and so that is what got voted off the U.S. House floor on on the 13th, the day before Valentine's Day, and it was voted and approved. And yes, so Senate nationally is just as hard as Senate here in the state. And it is one of those things where, you don't give up, So those senators nationally supposedly represent us and represent their states and their constituents. So again, it's about constantly talking about it, talking about why this is important, not letting it just fall into the ether, writing your senators, your U.S. senators, and encouraging anyone in other states to do the same. And regarding Ruth Bader Ginsburg, yes, I saw that as well. I don't know. I can't speak for her. I don't know. I don't know. There are many who I think feel that, coming anew might go more smoothly. I don't know her particular stance, because there were some folks who did actually draft legislation for a revised National Equal Rights Amendment, but it would mean starting all over. So I don't know if that's what she's meaning as well, as there was one that was drafted that has a totally different language. It's much more inclusive, much broader level of coverage as to, it's a lovely bill, but it would mean starting all over. So I don't know where she was coming from on that, but she does support it. She absolutely supports the Equal Rights Amendment, and in that article she talks about that she does hope to see that this happens at some point. And then I think you were actually next, and then the lady in front of you.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the wording in terms of discrimination based on sex versus discrimination based on gender. If it were passed with the wording based on sex, with current issues of gender identity, would that introduce problems?
So thank you for that question, and that actually raises something. There has been legislation as of last week introduced here in Minnesota State by two Republicans, so Senator Carla Nelson key-authored it, and Jensen co-authored along with Franzen. So now it's got bipartisan support of language mirroring the national. So it's basically swapped out the use of gender. Here in Minnesota for the state ERA, it was using the word gender instead of sex, but now this new bill is actually using the word sex instead of gender. So what we've seen in case law precedent is that the two, as far as litigation cases go, have been interchangeable. No, they are not synonymous, but as far as case law goes and that legal precedent has been set, it has been shown that they will be argued as having the same meaning. So yes, we are an all-inclusive movement. You know, this is equality of rights for all. And so that does absolutely mean any person who feels that they've been discriminated against based on their gender. And we don't get to say how do they define their gender, or, you know, were they born, you know, that's not up to anybody. If they are, you know, they are aligning as male or female, or, you know, they know what their gender is, those people in those communities. And so it covers everyone. And so as far as when you use the ERA, it is specifically about when you feel you've been discriminated against and you take your case to court and how that case gets reviewed. I don't know if that was, did that help? Did that answer?
It's reassuring, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. And then I believe you were next.
I was going to ask you about our two state senators where they stood, and you said that Carla Nelson is one of the sponsors for the ERA. Is that right?
The new one, using
The
that
new one.
national language, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And do you know where Senjum stands, our local? So we should write him.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we
Okay.
should, yes.
And then
write them both. So
both them.
don't not
Okay.
because
And support her.
yes.
Because yes.
And that's a big piece, is a lot of times we have had, because this is a bipartisan issue. This was originally written, you know, Alice Paul was a Republican. Up until Reagan, this was introduced by Republicans every year. And we've had many Republicans sign on and then remove their names. And so what's really important is that they hear from their constituents that, yes, this is very important.
And then, can you explain the history with the 14th Amendment? I kept hearing that as part of it, is that that's where some of the law comes from with that. But if you don't know, that's fine. I'm interested.
I will always be the first one to say, I don't have all my history memorized. Our website has all of this information on there. So you can absolutely go check it out. But as far as when we refer to the 14th Amendment, it's about when the word man and male was first introduced in writing in the Constitution. And so that's where this kind of starts to point at a document that was aimed, you know, it starts to be less vague as to who this was aimed towards. Yeah, but definitely for more information that I don't have all at hand, please do visit the website. And we have a bunch of, our website master is amazing. So it's all on there. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Has any other amendment ever had a time limit?
There have been a few, and so what's interesting with the deadline thing is that when they talk about a time limit, it refers in the Constitution as that this amendment must be ratified within a lifetime, and that's sort of the vague language. The amendment around congressional pay increase took over 203 years, and it went through. And so that obviously was not within a lifetime. And so that sets precedent to show, well, this got to go through. So there have been other amendments that took a very long time. And the deadline was not in the language of the amendment itself. And so that's another piece to it. So really the archivist has the power to say, yes, this amendment has gone through everything it needs to go through, checks all the boxes, and all the lawsuits are done, and whoever rises victorious, if that's all done, then the archivist has this say to say, yes, this is in. So again, with that congressional pay, I believe it wasn't the last one, but it was like the next to last. It was 203 years that it took for that one to go through. And there have been a couple that haven't ratified. There are more than just the ERA that had deadlines.
With actually a specified number of years that it had. At
that's a
one
good
point,
question.
it was taken seriously enough that they changed it.
They did.
They extended it.
Yes, they did. Correct. They gave it an extension. It was originally, I believe,
Congress
79.
made the deadline. It's
Correct.
not within
It's not in the body.
of the
Correct, yes.
And there was no deadline for the congressional pay one, so that is a difference.
But in the Constitution itself, when they talk about whether or not it's constitutional for amendments to have deadlines, because that's kind of the piece, is it actually constitutional to put a deadline on an amendment process? And so it talks about in the lifetime of the, of the amendment, or, and so that's the only thing it talks about in the Constitution. And so there's a lot of litigation going back and forth about whether or not it's actually constitutional to put a deadline on. But the fact that it's not in the language in the body of the amendment itself is very key. I didn't know, did anyone? I thought I saw someone. Did you have your hand up? No. Okay, no, you behind. No, I didn't know if you'd raised yours before. Okay, yeah.
What is the status of the lawsuits filed by the states who want to rescind their ratification?
So that's another piece as well, that there has been precedent set that states, once they've ratified, cannot rescind their ratification. They would have to introduce new legislation to basically remove the amendment, and that would then have to be ratified. So there have been previous case law showing that states have wanted to rescind the ratification of other amendments, and it was declared then that they could not. So there's more precedent set that no, they can't.
But you could pass a new amendment to nullify the previous amendment.
Yes.
So it's the rescinding part of it that creates havoc. I mean, all of the southern states wanted to rescind the 14th Amendment,
Yeah.
once they got the Jim Crow laws going. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So anyways, if you wanted to reverse an amendment, like, prohibition, you pass a new amendment. And so states, this idea of rescinding just seems sort of funny that they aren't, well, they're not brave enough to go and say, I'm going to bring a new amendment and go through all the work to repeal what happened in this state back in the 70s when we ratified. But I can see Justice Ginsburg's point. You start over again with new language, and you put all these modern-day politicians on the spot. Are you going to vote for this or not? Because it's easy for them to say, well, I don't want to rescind the limitations that a previous Congress put on. It introduces a different set of arguments to say, I'm not going to vote to rescind the wisdom of a previous Congress, than if we say to them, no, are you for the ERA or are you not? And I think a lot of state legislatures would pass it quickly of those who have already adopted it.
I agree.
But I think the other thing to remember is if you put an ERA in the, I'm sorry, I'll give you a moment here, Amy. If you put the ERA in the Minnesota State Constitution, that covers state laws. Okay, so it covers what the state has control over, which is significant, but it's different than what the federal Constitution controls. So you have to remember that even though that sounds like a wonderful solution, you have to have both.
You do have to, and that's the thing a lot of people ask is, well, and I think back when it was originally rolling through quickly, what I have heard Minnesota's excuse was that, well, we were going to get it federal, it was going to go through. But it doesn't cover, because of the way that our government is set up, states absolutely need to have that state level protection within their state constitutions as well as the national. So you have to have both, absolutely. Yeah, Amy.
But Jane, there's always a reason. If you're not old enough to remember Phyllis Schlafly, she promised if this passed, your daughters would be sent into combat and girls would have to share bathrooms with boys.
And widows wouldn't get their
I mean,
benefits.
you wouldn't have your protections. I remember at the time I lived in Michigan, looking up in Michigan law, what were the protections? And one of the things is women could not lift more than 30 pounds in a factory. And another law said that to be a foreman in a factory, you had to be able to lift 30 pounds.
Yeah.
So there's a big protection out of something. And now what we heard in the last year about why the Senate couldn't bring up the new Equal Rights Amendment, first of all, they just couldn't get their arms around gender. They acted like if it said sex, they would go for it, because gender you couldn't define. They went on and on, you can't define gender. But then they said, oh my gosh, this will lead to abortion on demand. And it wasn't enough to show them that abortion is already legal. You don't need the Equal Rights Amendment. You already have that. It's still, they wanted to put on whole bunches of, yes, women can be equal, but we want a whole bunch of stuff about abortion into this amendment. And if they want to do an abortion amendment, they can do it on their own. They shouldn't tag it on to the work we're doing.
And that's absolutely right. And that's where it says will not be, so abridged or denied. And automatically putting on any sort of disclaimer into an amendment is abridging and denying it. And yeah, that's absolutely true. That's that piece, is those protections, those laws, they can be taken away, they can be changed, they can be rolled over, unless you have something actually in the Constitution. It can change on a dime. And that's exactly the problem around especially pay equity and fair pay, is that when you're trying to compare, a female worker who's come from this history where she hasn't had the opportunities given that her male counterpart has had because of things like weightlifting restrictions or pregnancy discrimination. Maybe she had a baby and had to leave or was forced out of her job or out of her position, then couldn't be, given a raise or advancement. All these things that are set up, it's all those little things that if we had something in our Constitution, they'd have a much better chance to go forward and say, hey, this is what's going on. But right now, as it is, these supposedly protective laws can just do whatever they want with these current cases as they come forward. So it is about having something to ground in the Constitution. Yeah.
So the amendment says the federal government and no state government can do it. What about, say, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and other territories, counties, municipalities, Indian reservations, etc.?
That's a great question. I've never been asked that before. That's a really good question.
They're bound by the federal Constitution.
They are.
Any territory.
Tell the microphone
Wait.
will not get heard in the recording. Thank you.
Yes, well, when we talk about state laws, there are the rights reserved to the state, right? So those include things like, actually, it could have affected our trade life. Contract law was a matter of state law for a long time. So the Uniform Commercial Code came in so that we started to standardize so we wouldn't have a situation like Europe where we couldn't really trade across state lines without the rules changing and causing a lot of craziness. But when it comes to if the federal Constitution was amendment, it would apply to every entity that is covered under the United States Constitution. And the District of Columbia is, just because they can't vote in the Senate doesn't mean they can ignore federal law, or in Congress they don't have the right of representation. And the territories are also covered by federal law. But local laws, that would be different. In other words, DC has their own local laws. The state of Minnesota has laws that are different than the state of Wisconsin. And that's why this jigsaw puzzle means you really want the federal, in an ideal world, we would want the ERA with the same language, I would argue, in every 50 states and in the federal Constitution.
I will also add that constitutional law dictates that the federal law is one level. State law can give more rights than the federal law, but it cannot give fewer rights than the federal law.
Thank you.
What about individuals and... What about nonprofit groups, corporations, individuals, religious institutions, educational institutions, etc.?
Again, my knowledge of constitutional law is very limited, so if someone else knows...
Oh, good. Sarah. Let's let Sarah voice.
I love learning things, too. This is great.
Well, I'm not sure how this would work, but you hear the argument that, people assume the First Amendment guarantee of free speech means I can't stop you. I have the right to stop you from saying something, or you don't have the right to stop me from saying. But that, then the answer is that's the government doesn't have the right to stop you from free speech. But a corporation, you hear those arguments that the First Amendment, free speech, the government shall not do these things. But that doesn't mean that individuals or other people can't. I hear those arguments, and I'm with you thinking that, does that mean people could interpret this the same way?
So I think, attorneys are great at interpreting things, and I used to work in law firms, so I know this well. I was a paralegal for many years. Attorneys can meld, move, shape, however they think is going to best suit their case. So what it really comes down to is we will see. We will see how this plays out. So basically get it in there, and as cases come up, it really will depend on the court that's hearing those cases, who's sitting there, their personal attorney, there's so many factors involved that we can't say exactly how this is going to play out all across the board. But all we can say is it's really just about giving the opportunity for people to be treated more fairly, to have a better chance of being successful when they're feeling discriminated against than they currently do. That when you break it down, that's really what it is just saying, I shouldn't be discriminated against on my gender or sex the same way I shouldn't be discriminated against based on my eye color or on my race or on my, religion. It's that same backbone. And so as far as exactly how every case is going to turn out, we have no idea, because who knows? But it's just giving that level of respect, that level of scrutiny, and that protective class status to at least put it all on somewhat level standing.
Yes. Well, I do have my law degree, but as my son reminds me, since he just graduated not that long ago, things have changed since you were in law school, Mother. And I keep reminding him, you say that after I've paid the next tuition check, not before. But in fact, the federal Constitution is binding on all the citizens of the United States. All private parties, all private employers, everyone. Now, a lot of them are designed and specifically talk about government action. But the fact is that we can't just go off and do what we want without reference to federal law. You'd get into trouble pretty fast. So both state and federal law apply to the behavior of the individual where that amendment matters. Now, what you're thinking is private employers have a little more latitude than others, but a lot of that is based on statutory law and comes back to your point that if the only protections women have are statutory law, every legislature can rescind those, change them, just throw them out. By putting it in the Constitution, you have something that is much more difficult to amend, as we're finding out from the difficulties here, and it becomes permanent. It becomes more the law of the land, and the Constitution supersedes any statutory, city ordinance, city charter provisions. These are our foundational documents, and the idea that the foundational documents protect the rights of men, protect the rights of black men, but not women. It's really sort of a moral failing, and I think it's a mark against America, and we need to change it.
I think you need to start doing these presentations. And I couldn't say it better myself. Absolutely. Yeah, that's perfect. And it's exactly true. And it does come down to that cultural piece and that respect piece of I believe, we will see a shift over time when this gets into the Constitution, both in the state and federally. When it gets in, we will over time see a shift in respect in our culture, a change in that systemic violence against women, against genders, against transsexual, all of that. As the laws support people who have not been supported, that starts to shift the power and make it a little bit more fair.
Could you summarize the bills or the items on the agenda, both in Minnesota and nationally? And I'm trying to figure out how we should focus our attention in this election cycle.
That's a great question. Thank you. So Minnesota has bills to put an equal rights amendment into the state constitution. So there are currently now two versions. There was just one, where it's equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged on account of gender. Now there are two, one that says that and one that says on account of sex. So that's for Minnesota's state constitution. So if that gets out of the Senate, which we hope, and when it goes out to Minnesotans to vote on their ballot, it will say yes or no to this amendment language.
Won't they they'll get together though, and probably they could easily say sex or gender. I mean, because one is in one house and one is in the other house.
Right.
often if there are two different versions of a bill, and I defer to Amy Cockett on this because she knows how the legislature works a lot better than I do, but they have conference committees to reconcile the differences between the two versions of a very similar bill, a bill on the same subject. And I would argue, I think it would be best, since you asked me, to use both terms. So then we're not sitting around wondering, well, what does gender mean? And does it mean exactly the same as sex and the other way around? You want these things, especially something like an amendment on such a big philosophical position and position of importance, to be self-explanatory, to not have a lot of terms that need a lot of judicial interpretation. So I would be inclusive and suggest we do sex or gender, and then that be the version that goes forward. And if I ruled the world, that's the way it would be.
Right. And so that's the point, is we don't know right now which bill will come out of the Senate. So it could be that this newer version that says sex, that's the one the Senate gives a hearing, votes on, approves, and then what happens is, because that's different from the one the Minnesota House approved last session, yes, they would go to conference committee and sort of decide what they want to do between those two bodies. So it might be that the House says, okay, fine, we will say sex instead of gender, or they'll say we'll say sex and gender. They will battle that out. But at some point, there will be a version that goes to ballot, and that Minnesotans can vote on to say yes, they want, or no, they don't want an equal rights amendment saying equality of rights and law shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex or gender, whichever, in their state constitution. So then we also have bills here in Minnesota about removing that deadline. And so that went for that federal, just to urge Congress to say, hey, if this deadline issue comes up when that 38th state goes through, declare that the deadline is unconstitutional and therefore invalid. And so then a bunch of other states had done that as well. And so that got voted out of the Minnesota House as well. That bill has also not been heard, given a hearing in the Senate. So as it stands right now, the state ERA and that remove the deadline, neither of those bills have been given a hearing in the Minnesota Senate. So that's what we need this session, is to get hearings on these bills. And, so ERA Minnesota, our official stance has been that original bill for the state ERA of on account of gender. But if this new bill that says on account of sex, and we know that there is legal precedent set to guarantee that folks going forward as gender non-binary or transgender, that they, in case law, that precedent's been set that sex and gender can be used interchangeably. So we are comfortable supporting bills that get the Equal Rights Amendment into our Constitution, and for it to mirror the national language is not such a compromise, right? The national language is great language, and it's also been upheld and supported by, yes, it could be better, but it's been upheld and supported by Virginia's very own first transgender congressperson, who actually tattooed it on her arm. So we feel comforted in the fact that if that community, not everyone will like this. So just like, people will always, but again, that's what we hope for, is just to get an Equal Rights Amendment to the ballot this fall.
This is a small point, but it might be easier to get it passed if you didn't make it sex or gender. It sounds like the Senate is very afraid of that word gender and are running to the corners.
Yes. Well, what they actually told us in the House was, how can we do that to our constituents to expect that they'll know how to vote if it says gender? And I thought, well, how insulting of your constituents to think that they don't know what gender means. And how horrifying that these are your elected officials, saying that they don't trust that you know what you'd be voting for if it said gender.
If the bill makes it through the Senate and to the desk of the governor, there is time to put it on the ballot for this fall?
It doesn't have to go through the governor's office.
Oh.
So it literally just comes right out of the Senate, and it would have the conference committee with the House to go through any language changes, and then it would be yes on the ballot this fall.
What kind of vote? I mean, like 50%?
It has to be 51%. Yeah.
Of those voting in the election.
And in the Senate as well. I didn't know if you meant in the election or in the Senate, but both, yes. It's a majority vote.
Majority vote of those voting in the election, not on the issue.
Correct.
So people skipping it Or
it
no
means a no.
vote.
Yes.
So
Flip
you
your
can't-
ballot over. Always turn your ballot over because this will be on the back of the ballot. So, yeah, absolutely. A no vote, a no answer is a no vote. So thank you, Amy. That is a good point to raise. Any other questions?
Forgive me if I missed it, but
That's okay.
on the federal level then, this election cycle, should we address it to all candidates in general terms? Or are there any specific candidates or specific bills that we should address?
For the federal level?
Yes.
So for the federal level right now, it's no. I'm gonna say no. I think right now for the federal, I think for the delete the deadline bill, yes, you could support that, absolutely. Nancy Pelosi's office, but again, it came out of the House, so yes. So you're, for the Senate, for the federal bill, for that delete the deadline, yes, sorry, that you can do, absolutely. So contact your representatives and your legislators in the US Congress, in the Senate, to support that, and as well as your attorney generals, in those states who are currently fighting those cases, showing your support, so writing to them. So again, it's Illinois, Nevada, and Virginia who are pro getting that deadline removed, and then Alabama, Georgia, and South Dakota who are fighting against. So if you have any family, they can support their AGs or say, please, my AG, don't do this. And absolutely to your senators, say, we want this deadline removed. And our website, eramn.org, has all of this information on there. It has the bill numbers, both here in Minnesota and federally. And it can take you, it has links that go straight to the websites, and it has scripts. It has who to write, how to contact them, what bills to talk about. So if you go on there, you can find out both federally and here in Minnesota exactly who to write. Gives you a little framework of maybe how to write what you want to say, or you can write whatever you want to say. And we will be printing postcards soon. And if anyone wants postcards, I am happy to send them to you, because that's a big piece as well. And those can go federally or here in Minnesota. You wanted specific legislators, didn't you? Oh, sorry, go ahead. Good.
Thank you. One last, forgive my ignorance question. Before we end, could we hear from the league whether there are league positions either at the local or the state level relating?
Mm-hmm. And did you have a question?
Again, assuming this passes and will be on the ballot this fall, do you have plans for an extensive campaign to support it?
Of course we do, but we always need help. A lot of help, because it's not just about us. This is about everyone in Minnesota fighting for this. So yes, we are fundraising, we are raising money, we are trying to put together a plan, not just for this session, but going into either a get out the vote sort of situation or a election situation. So if it's not on the ballot this fall, this very much then becomes an election piece, just like it did in 2018 for the House of Representatives. So connecting with newspapers and media, sharing across social media, talking to friends and family, doing house parties, all of that applies, and we have plans to ramp up, should it go either way. But we always need help in. Yes, we have brochures, we have a sign-up sheet back there on the table if anyone wants to get our emails. You can also go to the website and sign up right there through the website to get our emails. We have all of our materials on there that you can print. This is about everyone taking and going and doing. We don't have to guide the ship.
And I'm going to ask Jane to talk about the league's position on this issue.
And once again, I'm president of the local Rochester League of Women Voters. So all members of the board and all members of the League of Women Voters. Does the league support the ERA? Everyone say yes!
So does AAUW.
Yay!
AAUW also supports it, according to Amy. Yes.
I have an ask for the League of Women Voters and the AAUW. In Ely, the AAUW and the Rotary Club joined together around pay equity. They got, I believe they're at 95 or 98 businesses out of the 100 that they were going for to sign on for equal pay. They co-host an equal pay day event every year, and they do a lot of sort of awareness and discussions and all that together. And they don't have a League of Women Voters group up in Ely, so that's why it's just the AAUW. I am encouraging folks everywhere to talk to their Rotary Club and to use that and to say, hey, here's a way that we can get together and continue to grow this. So if anyone's feeling really brave and want to join together, Ely said they're happy to help with anyone who's doing this. I've spoken with the folks in Wilmer with their, I think it's the League of Women Voter group, or it's their AAW group. Yeah, Mary Swatsky, I don't know which one she's with. So working with them to kind of do the same thing. So that's something, if people are a part of an Elks Club, a Rotary Club, anything like that, religious institutions, educational institutions, we do talks in classrooms. That's one of my favorite things to do in the whole world, is to talk to kids about this, as well as the big kids. And so that's something as well, as another way of educating, raising awareness, because that's the biggest piece around this. So that's my ask as well to the League and the AAW, is to consider, because we have resolutions, that's another thing, your city councils, all those, we have that on the website if you want to do a resolution. Ramsey County is one of my favorite to talk about. Last year, they passed a resolution that they couldn't even get heard. And finally, they said, okay, we'll give you some numbers. So they came up with, in 1 year, Ramsey County alone could save the MFIP program $8 million if they closed the 26% pay gap between men and women. Every year, $8 million every year of taxpayer money could be saved if the pay gap were taken care of just in Ramsey County. They presented those findings to the rest of the commissioners, who were immediately like, yes, we're on board. And so we got Ramsey County to sign on as a resolution of support for the ERA. So that's a big piece to talk about. A lot of people get afraid of the ERA, whether it's about abortion, whether it's about family values, whether it's about all this. It's not about any of all that. That is not what it's about. All it is about putting folks on a more equal level playing field under the law. Anyone else? Thank you, everybody, so much for coming. Thank you for being here. And thank you, the library, and thank you, League of Women Voters, and AAW folks for everything you're doing, and all of you for everything you're doing.